Summer 2023. High above the ancient rolling spines of the Appalachian Mountains, a survey drone cut a silent, surgical path through the humid air. Its mission was clinical, mapping the rugged West Virginia terrain for a future wind farm project. Below, a dense canopy of oak and hickory trees concealed the earth, a green carpet hiding ravines, forgotten hollows, and secrets buried for generations. The drone was an emissary of the future, its sophisticated sensors designed to chart topography and soil density, utterly indifferent to the human histories that had unfolded and ended in the shadows of these timeless hills. It was a machine built to look forward, but on this day, it would force an entire community to look back into a past they thought was long settled. The drone's operator, miles away in a climate-controlled trailer, monitored a stream of data flowing onto his screen. The LiDAR system painted a precise digital model of the landscape, stripping away the foliage to reveal the stark, raw earth beneath. He was looking for stable ground, for ridges that could support the immense weight of modern turbines. His focus was on geological viability, not historical anomalies. The work was methodical, almost monotonous, a repetitive sweep over miles of uninhabited wilderness. The drone was simply an extension of his will, a tireless eye in the sky, methodically erasing the unknown from the map, one pixel at a time, unaware it was about to redraw a story 50 years cold. Suddenly, an alert flashed on the screen, an unnatural shape, a long, perfectly straight line in a landscape defined by nature's chaotic curves. The operator zoomed in, filtering the data. It wasn't a rock formation or a logging road long since reclaimed by the forest. It was metallic, dense, and located in a deep, almost inaccessible ravine, nearly 3 miles from the nearest abandoned railway line. It was an impossibility, a geometric scar on the land's organic flesh. He marked the coordinates, a flicker of professional curiosity piercing his routine. He sent the drone back for a visual pass, its programming shifting from wide-angle mapping to focused investigation, descending toward the anomaly that defied all logic. The drone dipped below the tree line, its rotors stirring leaves that hadn't been disturbed by anything but the wind for decades. The high-resolution camera focused, cutting through the dappled sunlight. There it was. The unmistakable form of a freight car, its steel hide oxidized to a deep, mottled brown that blended almost perfectly with the soil and fallen leaves. It was half buried, tilted at a severe angle, as if it had fallen from the sky. Thick vines wrapped around its frame like skeletal fingers, and a mature poplar tree had grown straight through a gaping hole in its roof. It was a steel tomb, a relic of an industrial age, left to be consumed by the wilderness, a silent, rusting testament to a forgotten catastrophe. November 12, 1973. 50 years before the drone's discovery, the air in Beckley, West Virginia, was sharp with the scent of burning coal and decaying leaves. Arthur Coleman stood in his small kitchen, the warmth of a fresh cup of coffee, a small comfort against the morning chill. He was 42 years old, a man etched by his trade, with hands calloused from years of working the levers and brakes of freight trains. His face was lined with the quiet concentration of a man who understood the immense power he commanded daily. He was a train engineer for the Blackwood Consolidated Minerals Company, a respected figure in a town built on the very resource he transported. This morning was like any other, a routine departure for a routine haul. He pulled on his heavy canvas jacket, the fabric worn soft in the places where he moved most. His wife stood by the door, her expression a familiar mixture of pride and worry. His young daughter, Sarah's mother-to-be, clung to his leg, her small face buried in the denim of his work pants. He knelt down, his large, gentle hand stroking her hair. "Be a good girl for your mom," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "I'll be back before you know it." He kissed his wife, a silent promise exchanged in a fleeting touch. It was a ritual of departure they had performed hundreds of times. A simple act of love and reassurance before he went to wrestle 1,000 tons of steel and coal through the mountains. At the rail yard, freight train BCM 734 waited, a behemoth of iron and power hissing impatiently in the cold air. The official cargo manifest, clipped to a board in the dispatch office, was straightforward and unremarkable. 30 cars, loaded with high-grade bituminous coal from the Blackwood mines, destined for a power plant up north. It was the lifeblood of the region, a mundane but vital cargo. Arthur did his pre-run inspection with practiced efficiency, checking gauges, testing brake lines, his movements economical and sure. The train was an extension of himself, a familiar and predictable machine he knew better than anyone. Nothing about the manifest or the train's condition suggested this run would be any different from the last. Climbing into the engineer's seat, Arthur felt the familiar thrum of the locomotive's engine through the floor. He gave a short blast of the horn, a signal that echoed off the surrounding hills, and slowly eased the throttle forward. The immense weight of the train groaned in response, the rhythmic clack of the wheels on the steel rails beginning their steady, hypnotic beat. The train pulled out of the yard, leaving the small town behind as it wound its way into the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Appalachian Range. Arthur Coleman was at the helm, a solitary figure guiding a serpent of steel through a landscape he knew intimately, completely unaware that he was on a one-way journey into a 50-year mystery. Hours later, deep within the winding mountain passes, BCM 734 was scheduled to radio in at a checkpoint. The call never came. The dispatcher tried again, his voice crackling over the radio waves, receiving only static in return. The train, its cargo, and its engineer had vanished. On the master map in the control room, the light representing BCM 734 simply blinked out, leaving an empty space on the track where a train should be. There was no distress signal, no wreckage, no sign of a derailment. An entire freight train, with its sole occupant, Arthur Coleman, had been erased from existence somewhere in the deep woods of West Virginia, beginning a half-century of silence, rumor, and unanswered questions. Sarah Coleman's apartment in Charleston was a controlled chaos of research notes, half-empty coffee mugs, and the low hum of a news channel playing on a muted television. At 35, she had carved out a career as an investigative journalist by finding patterns in the noise, by connecting forgotten dots. That afternoon, she was deep into a story about municipal zoning fraud, her focus absolute, her world narrowed to spreadsheets and public records. The TV was just background static, a flickering light in her peripheral vision that she had long since trained herself to ignore. She was chasing a modern-day deception, a story of digital trails and paper lies, completely oblivious to the fact that a ghost from her family's deepest past was about to break through the screen and demand her full, undivided attention. It was a single word that shattered her concentration. Appalachia! Her head lifted slightly. Then another. Beckley. A cold knot began to form in her stomach. She reached for the remote, unmuting the television just as the anchor said, "A 50-year-old mystery." Sarah froze, her fingers hovering over the volume button. The screen showed aerial footage, a sweeping shot of dense, unforgiving forest. The anchor's voice continued, calm and professional, describing how a survey drone had stumbled upon the wreckage. The word train hung in the air, electric and heavy. For most viewers, it was a fascinating local news item, a curious relic from a bygone era. For Sarah, it felt like a summons, a voice calling out from a grave she had been told her entire life was empty. The drone footage filled the screen, grainy and surreal. There it was, a rusted metal carcass half swallowed by the earth, its form almost organic, like the fossilized remains of some prehistoric beast. Vines clung to it, trees grew through it, nature's slow, patient work of erasure nearly complete. Sarah leaned closer, her eyes tracing the impossible straight line of the freight car's roof against the wild chaos of the woods. This was the monster from her family's folklore, the physical manifestation of a story that had been passed down in hushed, ashamed whispers. The legend of the runaway engineer and his stolen train wasn't just a story anymore. It was real, it was there, and it had been waiting in the dark for half a century. The train, designated BCM 734, the reporter stated, was under the command of engineer Arthur Coleman when it vanished in November of 1973. The name hit Sarah with the force of a physical impact, stealing the air from her lungs. Arthur Coleman, her grandfather. A name she had only ever heard spoken with a sigh of resignation, or a sharp, clipped bitterness. To hear it now, broadcast into her living room, attached not to a myth of theft and desertion, but to a tangible physical discovery, was profoundly disorienting. The entire narrative of her family, the one built on a foundation of shame and unanswered questions, had just cracked wide open. The man who was a ghost, a cautionary tale, suddenly had a tomb. Her mind was a torrent of fragmented memories. She remembered being a child, asking her mother why they didn't have any pictures of Grandpa Arthur. She recalled the way her grandmother's face would shudder, becoming a mask of impenetrable grief and anger. "He left us," was the only explanation ever offered, a three-word sentence that carried the weight of a lifetime of pain. He was the man who chose a train full of coal over his own family, the town drunk, the reckless fool, the thief. Every version of the story painted him as a villain. But looking at the image of that half-buried train car, so deliberately hidden, so far from any track, a different story began to fight its way to the surface. A wave of raw, unfiltered emotion washed over her. Shock, confusion, a deep, resonant ache for the family she knew and the grandfather she didn't. But beneath it all, something else stirred. A fierce, undeniable flicker of vindication. The train was found. It hadn't simply vanished into thin air as the company, Blackwood Consolidated Minerals, had always claimed. It hadn't been driven off a cliff in a drunken stupor. It was placed there, hidden. This single, undeniable fact didn't answer any questions, but it posed 1,000 new ones, each one challenging the official narrative that had poisoned her family's name for 50 years. The shame she had carried felt, for the first time, like it might not belong to her. Her hands, slick with a nervous sweat, fumbled for her phone. Her thumb hovered over her mother's contact photo. What would she say? "Mom, they found him. Or at least, they found his train." How do you deliver news that is both a miracle and a curse? This discovery would dredge up every painful memory her mother had spent a lifetime trying to bury. It would force her to confront the image of the father who abandoned her, a wound that had never properly healed. Sarah hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just a news story breaking. It was a family breaking open, its carefully constructed scar tissue about to be torn away to see if the wound beneath had ever truly closed. Then, her thoughts turned to her grandmother, Eleanor, a woman of iron will who had survived the scandal by encasing her husband's memory in impenetrable silence. For 50 years, Arthur Coleman had not existed within the walls of her home. This news would be a siege upon that fortress. Sarah could picture her now, sitting in her armchair, watching the same local news report, her expression unreadable, her posture rigid. Eleanor would not welcome this. She would see it as a desecration, a disturbance of a long-settled peace, however bitter that peace might be. But Sarah knew the silence couldn't hold. Not anymore. The earth itself had finally spoken, and its voice would be impossible to ignore. The journalist inside her, momentarily stunned by the personal shock, roared back to life. Her mind began to race, compartmentalizing emotion and focusing on the facts. The location, miles from the original tracks. How? The angle of the car. It looked dropped, not derailed. Why? The official story, the one Blackwood Consolidated had sold to the papers and the police in 1973, was that Arthur Coleman had gone rogue, stealing the coal. But this scene didn't look like a theft. It looked like a burial. It was too clean, too deliberate. You don't hide something you stole. You sell it. You hide something you want no one to ever find. The questions multiplied, insistent and sharp, forming the outline of a conspiracy. She pushed herself up from the couch, a new energy coursing through her veins. It was a potent mix of grief, anger, and professional adrenaline. Pacing the worn floorboards of her apartment, she felt a profound shift occur within her. This was no longer someone else's story to tell. It was hers. It had always been hers, lying dormant, waiting for a signal. The drone had been that signal. In that moment, a quiet promise solidified in her heart, spoken only to herself but with the force of a public vow. She would find out what really happened on November 12, 1973. She would follow this trail back to its beginning, no matter how dark the path became. "We're getting the truth," she whispered to the empty room. "For him." The weight of that promise was immense, settling on her shoulders like her grandfather's old canvas jacket, something she imagined he would have worn. This was more than an investigation. It was an excavation of her own history, a quest to reclaim a name that had been synonymous with shame. The story was no longer about a runaway engineer. It was about a man who was erased. Uncovering the truth meant confronting not just a 50-year-old mystery, but the powerful forces that had created it. Forces that were likely still there, still guarding their secrets. The path forward was treacherous and unknown, but for the first time in her life, it was illuminated by a single, burning light, the possibility of justice for Arthur Coleman. Beckley, West Virginia, in 1973, was a town carved from coal and timber, its fortunes rising and falling with the price of a ton of bituminous. The air itself tasted of industry, a metallic tang that clung to everything. Life was governed by the shrill blast of the mine whistle and the distant, mournful call of freight trains winding through the hollows. At the center of this universe was Blackwood Consolidated Minerals, a company that was more than an employer. It was a feudal lord. It owned the mines, the company's store, and for the most part the narrative of the town. In the wider world, the nation was gripped by the Watergate scandal, a slow-motion collapse of trust and authority that felt distant to the people of Beckley, who had long understood that power, not truth, was what truly mattered in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains. Arthur Coleman was a man of routine and quiet competence, a respected engineer who knew the treacherous mountain passes like the lines on his own calloused hands. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or reckless behavior. His world was one of gauges, brake pressure, and the immense responsibility of guiding thousands of tons of steel safely through the wilderness. At home, he was a devoted husband to his wife Eleanor, and a doting father to their young daughter. He was the kind of man neighbors relied on, a steady presence in a town where life could be precarious. The official story that would later be told, of a thief, a drunk, a man who would abandon his family for a trainload of coal, was so profoundly out of character that it should have been dismissed as an absurdity from the very start. Life in the Coleman household was modest but filled with a warmth that defied the ever-present coal dust. Their small home on the edge of town was a sanctuary from the harsh realities of the mining world. Eleanor, a woman of quiet strength, managed their lives with a careful hand, her days marked by the rhythm of Arthur's shifts. There was a constant, low-level anxiety that came with loving a man in a dangerous profession, a fear she never spoke aloud but which lived in her heart. Their daughter, who would one day become Sarah's mother, knew her father as a gentle giant whose work jacket smelled of steel and diesel, a scent that meant safety and home. It was a simple, ordinary life, built on a foundation of love and trust that seemed unbreakable. When train BCM 734 vanished on November 12, 1973, the initial reaction in Beckley was one of confusion and fear, not suspicion. A derailment was the most likely culprit, a tragic but understood risk of the job. The first search parties were a disorganized mix of company men and local volunteers combing the dense forests along the known railway lines. A young state trooper named Frank Miller was assigned to the case, and from the beginning he felt something was wrong. The complete lack of evidence, no wreckage, no distress call, not even a single piece of debris, was deeply unsettling. He noted how quickly officials from Blackwood Consolidated arrived, their presence less about assistance and more about control, steering the investigation and shaping the conversation before a single clue could be discovered. Within days, the narrative began to shift, subtly at first, then with brutal efficiency. Whispers started in the company offices. and spread through the town like a contagion. Arthur Coleman had a drinking problem, some said. He was in debt, others claimed. Blackwood Consolidated, leveraging its influence with the local newspaper, began to paint a picture of a disgruntled employee who had finally snapped. They released a statement expressing disappointment and hinted at a man who had betrayed their trust. The official manifest, listing only Cole, was presented as proof of his motive, a simple, greedy theft. It was a masterful campaign of character assassination, turning a respected family man into a local pariah, a convenient scapegoat for a mystery the company had no intention of solving. The public shaming fell upon the Coleman family like a physical blow. Eleanor, once a proud and integrated member of the community, found herself an outcast. The sympathetic glances turned to stares of pity and contempt. She retreated into a fortress of silence, her grief curdling into a hard, bitter anger. She refused to speak her husband's name, erasing him from the family history in a desperate act of self-preservation. For Arthur's daughter, the loss was twofold. She lost her father, and then she lost the memory of him, replaced by a shameful story she was too young to understand, but whose weight she felt every single day. The family name, once a source of pride, became a stain, a legacy of betrayal that would be passed down to the next generation. Over the years, the story of Arthur Coleman and his ghost train became a piece of Appalachian folklore. It was a cautionary tale told in hushed tones, a local legend that served to reinforce the power of the mountains to swallow secrets whole. The runaway engineer became a mythical figure, a specter who haunted the winding tracks of West Virginia. The truth of what happened on that cold November day was buried under 50 years of rumor, myth, and deliberate misdirection. The disappearance of BCM 734 was no longer treated as an unsolved case, but as a closed chapter, a strange but settled part of the region's history. Its central victim's name forever synonymous with greed and dishonor. Decades later, and miles away in Charleston, Sarah Coleman had built a life for herself, driven by a relentless pursuit of facts. As an investigative journalist, her job was to expose the kind of lies that festered in the shadows of power, a calling she pursued with a fierce, almost obsessive dedication. She knew the official story of her grandfather, the one her family reluctantly carried, but it was a distant history, a piece of a past she had tried to keep separate from her professional identity. She was a woman who built her world on verifiable proof and documented evidence, completely unaware that the biggest lie of her life, the one that had shaped her entire family, was about to be unearthed by a machine flying silently over the mountains she had left behind. Frank Miller, at 72, lived a life defined by the quiet rhythm of retirement in a small house just outside Beckley. The walls of his study were lined with commendations and photographs from a long career in law enforcement, but his gaze often fell on an empty space on the shelf, a space he had mentally reserved for the one case that had eluded him. The disappearance of BCM 734 was not just an unsolved file, it was a ghost that haunted his waking hours. He remembered the arrogance of the Blackwood executives, the strange lack of debris, and the way the investigation was steered away from the company and squarely onto the shoulders of Arthur Coleman. He had been too young, too inexperienced to push back effectively, a failure of nerve that had festered into a deep, abiding regret for 50 years, waiting for a second chance that he never believed would come. Meanwhile, William Blackwood, Jr. presided over the modern incarnation of his father's empire from a sleek, glass-walled office overlooking Charleston. At 60, he was the picture of corporate respectability, a patron of the arts, and a champion of West Virginia's economic revitalization. He spoke of transparency and a sustainable future, spearheading projects like the very wind farm that was now mapping his company's historical sins. Blackwood Jr. was a master of image, carefully curating a public persona that was worlds away from the ruthless industrialist his father had been. He was the polished, smiling guardian of a legacy built on a foundation of lies, a man who understood that power wasn't just about owning the mines, but about owning the story, and he would protect that story at any cost. Within the Coleman family, the past was a locked room, and Eleanor, Arthur's widow, held the only key. Now, in her late 70s, her grief had long since calcified into an impenetrable stoicism. She had survived the public shaming by excising her husband from every conversation, every photograph, every memory. For her, Arthur Coleman had died twice, once in the mountains, and a second time by her own deliberate hand. Sarah's mother lived in the shadow of this silence, a woman caught between a father she barely remembered and a mother who refused to. The name Arthur was a wound that the family had agreed never to touch, allowing it to fester in the dark for 5 decades, a shared trauma that bound them together in a conspiracy of silence. Unbeknownst to them all, a physical piece of Arthur Coleman's voice lay dormant in the attic of his old home, now occupied by his aging widow. Tucked inside a dusty, forgotten footlocker was his work journal. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, its pages filled with his neat, methodical handwriting. It contained notes on engine performance, weather conditions, and the mundane details of a train engineer's life. But the final entries, penned in the days leading up to November 12, 1973, were different. The script was hurried, the tone anxious. It was a relic, a primary source document of a man's final days, a silent witness waiting for a question that no one had ever thought to ask, holding the key that could unlock the entire 50-year-old mystery. In the town of Beckley and the surrounding hollows, the story of Arthur Coleman had transcended fact and become folklore. He was the runaway engineer, a local boogeyman whose ghost was said to haunt the winding mountain tracks on moonless nights. The tale was a warning against greed and betrayal, a story told to children and whispered over beers in dimly lit taverns. The narrative crafted by Blackwood Consolidated had been so effective that it had been absorbed into the very cultural fabric of the region. The lie had become a legend, a convenient and thrilling story that completely obscured the far more sinister truth. To challenge the legend was to challenge the town's own accepted history, a task that would require more than just evidence. It would require a fundamental shift in collective memory. Before the drone made its discovery, these separate lives existed in a state of fragile, long-held equilibrium. Sarah pursued truth for strangers, channeling her innate sense of justice into a career that kept her a safe distance from her own family's untruths. Frank Miller lived with the quiet hum of regret, a man whose peace was predicated on the belief that the past was unchangeable. William Blackwood, Jr. enjoyed the fruits of a protected legacy, his power and influence secure. And the Coleman women survived, bound by their unspoken pact of silence. Each of them had, in their own way, made a form of peace with the events of 1973. It was a bitter, incomplete peace, but it was one that held their worlds together, completely unaware that it was all about to be violently torn apart. The Appalachian Mountains themselves were a silent character in this long drama. Ancient, weathered, and deeply secretive, their dense forests and shadowed ravines had always been a place where things could get lost. People, stories, secrets. They held the history of the region in their very soil, from forgotten native trails to the scars of strip mining. The wind farm project was meant to be a symbol of a new era, a clean break from the dirty legacy of coal. Its LiDAR technology, designed to strip away the foliage and map the earth with unerring precision, was an agent of modernity. It was a tool of the future, sent to chart a path forward, but it would instead force everyone to look back into the darkest corners of the past. This impending collision of past and present hung in the humid summer air. The drone, a silent, unfeeling machine, was the catalyst. It had no concept of history, no understanding of the human drama buried beneath the trees. It was simply following a programmed path, collecting data points. Yet its mission was about to trigger a chain reaction that would unravel a meticulously constructed lie, challenge a powerful dynasty, and force a granddaughter to confront the ghost of the grandfather she never knew. The stage was set. The characters were in place, and the quiet, 50-year truce between truth and deception was about to be broken by a single, impossible image on a screen. The first call Sarah made was not to her mother, but to a contact at the West Virginia State Police. Using her press credentials, she tried to get an official statement, something more than the vague report from the television news. She was met with a wall of bureaucratic procedure and carefully worded non-answers. "The investigation is active and ongoing," a public information officer told her, his voice flat and rehearsed. "We cannot comment on the specifics of the cargo at this time." This official silence was more damning than any confession. It was the sound of a narrative being controlled, of a story being shaped before it could be told. Frustrated but not deterred, Sarah packed an overnight bag, threw her laptop inside, and started the 2-hour drive to Beckley. She needed to be there, to breathe the same mountain air, to stand on the ground where the lies began. Her journey was a pilgrimage back into a past she had actively avoided. The familiar winding roads of the Appalachians, flanked by dense walls of green, felt different this time. They were no longer just scenery. They were a crime scene, a vast, 50-year-old tomb. As she drove, the local radio station provided an update. The state police had officially confirmed the freight car's serial number matched one from the missing BCM 734 train. The recovery was proving difficult due to the remote and treacherous terrain. The anchor repeated the official line about the cargo being unidentified, but added a new detail. A forensics team from Charleston was being brought in. This wasn't a standard procedure for a simple derailment. It was the kind of response reserved for something far more complex, something that required specialists who could read the secrets held in wood, metal, and time. Back in Charleston, before leaving, Sarah had spent hours digging through online newspaper archives from 1973. She scanned grainy articles about the disappearance, her eyes catching on a name mentioned in a single, brief report: State Trooper Frank Miller, the initial investigator assigned to the case. A quick search of public records showed he was still alive, retired, and living in a small town just outside of Beckley. Her heart pounded as she dialed his number, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. What if he hung up on her? What if he still believed her grandfather was a thief? When an old, gravelly voice answered, she took a deep breath. "Mr. Miller," she began, "my name is Sarah Coleman. I'm Arthur Coleman's granddaughter, and I need to talk to you about the train." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a pause that seemed to stretch across 5 decades. Frank Miller agreed to meet her at a small roadside diner, a place where the coffee was strong and the memories were long. He was a man worn down by time, but his eyes held a sharp, unextinguished fire. He listened intently as Sarah spoke, his expression shifting from weary skepticism to a deep, resonant understanding. When she finished, he slid a worn, folded document across the table. It was a photocopy of the original 1973 cargo manifest for BCM 734. "I kept a copy of everything," he said, his voice a low rumble of long-held regret. "They'd told me to close the case," said Coleman was a drunk who ran off with the coal. It never sat right. Never. The brittle paper felt electric in Sarah's hands. It was the first piece of physical evidence, the foundational lie upon which the entire 50-year story had been built. The manifest was brutally simple, a testament to the mundane face of a great deception. It listed 30 freight cars, each line item reading, "high-grade bituminous coal." The total weight was calculated, the destination logged, and the document was signed by a Blackwood Consolidated dispatcher whose name was now just a faded scrawl. It was a portrait of routine commerce, a perfectly ordinary shipping document from an era of typewriters and carbon copies. Sarah stared at the words, feeling a profound sense of dislocation. This piece of paper had condemned her grandfather, branded her family, and shaped the entire course of her life. It was so simple, so believable, and she now knew with every fiber of her being that it was a complete and utter fabrication. The cold, hard fact of the document made the emotional weight of its lie feel even heavier. Later that night, sitting in a sterile Beckley motel room, Sarah's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a trusted source inside the state police. Attached was a single, blurry photograph taken on a cell phone. It showed the inside of the recovered freight car. There was no coal. Instead, the space was filled with a dozen massive wooden crates, dark with age and dampness. They were bound with steel bands, and, even in the poor light, she could make out a strange symbol stenciled on the side of one. A stylized eagle, its wings spread wide, clutching not arrows or an olive branch, but a heavy industrial gear. It was a logo she had never seen before, bearing no resemblance to the branding of Blackwood Consolidated Minerals or any other company she could find in a frantic online search. It was alien, militaristic, and deeply unsettling. The juxtaposition of the two pieces of evidence laid out on her motel bed was dizzying. On one side, the official 1973 manifest, declaring a mundane shipment of coal. On the other, the 2023 photograph showing a secret cargo of sealed, mysterious crates marked with an unknown emblem. This was the moment the case cracked wide open. The official story wasn't just wrong, it was a deliberate cover-up. Her grandfather hadn't stolen a common fuel source. He had been in command of a train carrying something far more valuable, something someone was willing to kill to protect. A wave of cold fury washed over her, sharpening her grief into a fine, pointed weapon. She was no longer just searching for a family truth. She was hunting a conspiracy, and she finally had the scent of the trail. Her phone rang again, shattering the silence of the room. It was Frank Miller. His voice was strained, urgent. "I've been thinking about that symbol you described," he said, skipping any greeting. "The eagle and the gear. It sounds familiar, but I can't place it. It's not corporate. It feels older, like something from the war." He paused, and Sarah could hear the faint sound of him turning the pages of a book. "Listen to me, Sarah. This isn't just about Blackwood anymore. People don't go to these lengths to hide coal or even standard contraband. Whatever your grandfather was hauling, it was something people were willing to bury for half a century. Be careful. You're not just digging up a local mystery. You're knocking on the door of something much, much bigger." The cold dread that followed Frank Miller's warning was a physical thing, a weight that settled deep in Sarah's bones. She stared at the blurry photograph on her phone, the image of the crates burning itself into her memory. The eagle and gear symbol seemed to stare back, a silent mocking cipher from a world she didn't understand. This was no longer about clearing a family name from a 50-year-old stain of petty theft. This was something else entirely. The calculated precision of the train's concealment, the official silence, and now this unknown militaristic emblem, it all pointed to a conspiracy that was deeper, darker, and far more organized than a simple corporate cover-up. The fear was real, a primal instinct screaming at her to walk away, but it was eclipsed by a cold, burning rage. They hadn't just erased her grandfather. They had buried him under a lie so vast it had stood undisturbed for half a century. Her journalistic training kicked in, a familiar armor against the storm of emotion. She spent the entire night in the stale air of the Beckley motel room, the glow of her laptop screen her only companion. Her mission was singular: identify the symbol. She dove into digital archives, searching for military insignia from the Cold War era, private security contractor logos, and even the emblems of obscure industrial consortiums from the 1970s. Every search was a dead end. The eagle and gear existed in a vacuum, absent from any official database or historical record she could access. This lack of a digital footprint was, in itself, a terrifying clue. It suggested a level of secrecy that predated the Internet, an organization so clandestine it had never needed a public face, operating entirely in the shadows where its secrets were meant to remain forever. The next morning, frustrated by the digital brick wall, Sarah knew she needed to see the physical location. She called Frank Miller, who, despite his own warnings, agreed to guide her. His voice held a note of weary resignation, the sound of a man who knew he was about to step back into the one case that had defined his career's greatest failure. They drove his old pickup truck as close as they could to the recovery site, but the area was now a fortress. State police cruisers formed a hard perimeter, and stern-faced officials in dark SUVs turned away anyone who approached. From a ridge overlooking the ravine, they could see the glint of the freight car's exposed metal and the methodical, almost sterile movements of the forensics team below. It was clear this was no longer a local police matter. It was a scene under the control of powerful, unseen forces. Watching the controlled chaos from the overlook, Frank's gaze grew distant. He pointed a weathered finger toward the distant hills. "William Blackwood Sr. stood right over there 50 years ago," he said, his voice a low gravel. He wasn't panicked, like a man who'd lost a valuable asset. He was cold, angry like someone dealing with a messy inconvenience. I remember him on his car radio, not the police band. Something private. He kept saying the same phrase over and over. "The package is compromised. Sundown is a no-go." At the time, I thought it was just company jargon. Now it sounds like something else entirely. The words hung in the air, a ghost of a conversation from 1973, providing Sarah with the first hint of a code name, a key to unlock the conspiracy's language. Blocked by the official cordon and armed with a cryptic code name, Sarah pivoted. She couldn't get to the evidence, so she would get to the people analyzing it. She sent another encrypted message to her source within the state police, keeping her request simple and direct. Who is the lead specialist analyzing the contents of the Beckley crates? She knew it was a long shot, a request that could easily be ignored or, worse, get her source into serious trouble. But her instincts told her that the identity of the expert would reveal more than any police report. The choice of who was brought in to examine the evidence would betray the nature of the evidence itself. She waited, the minutes stretching into an hour, her phone feeling heavier and heavier in her hand. The reply, when it came, was a single name and a title: Dr. Evelyn Reed, forensic historian, specializing in World War II-era asset provenance. Sarah's blood ran cold. She immediately pulled up Dr. Reed's university profile. Her publications were dense academic treatises on tracking art, gold, and scientific documents looted by the Nazis and subsequently lost in the chaos following the war. Why in God's name would the state of West Virginia call in one of the nation's foremost experts on Nazi plunder to investigate a supposedly derailed coal train from 1973? The question answered itself with terrifying clarity. The crates didn't contain simple contraband. They contained pieces of a history someone had tried to steal and then bury forever. A crime that reached back across the Atlantic and into the darkest chapter of the 20th century. The revelation struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She stumbled back against Frank's truck, the world tilting on its axis. Her grandfather, Arthur Coleman, the simple train engineer from Beckley, the man her family had been taught to despise as a common thief, had been at the helm of a train carrying Nazi-looted treasure. The sheer scale of the lie was dizzying, almost incomprehensible. The shame her family had carried for 50 years wasn't just misplaced. It was a grotesque injustice, a carefully crafted fiction designed to conceal a crime of monumental proportions. Her personal quest to clear his name had just violently collided with one of history's greatest evils. The weight of it was immense, a responsibility that was both terrifying and galvanizing. She knew, with absolute certainty, that the answers she needed now wouldn't be found in police files or on a computer screen. The key to understanding her grandfather's role in this had to be hidden somewhere closer to home, buried within the family's own conspiracy of silence. Her hands trembled as she dialed her mother's number. "Mom," she began, her voice strained, "I need you to think really hard. When Grandpa Arthur disappeared, did Grandma Eleanor keep any of his things from the railroad? A toolbox? Papers? Anything?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with the static of 50 years of unspoken pain. Then, her mother's voice, hesitant and small. "There's his old work footlocker. In Grandma's attic. She locked it the day they stopped searching and never opened it again." The drive to her grandmother's house was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every familiar curve in the road, every shadowed hollow, seemed to hold a piece of the 50-year silence that had defined her family. Sarah rehearsed the words she would say. but they all felt hollow and inadequate. How do you ask a woman who built a fortress around her pain to hand you the key to its deepest chamber? Eleanor Coleman was a woman of iron will, forged in the fires of public shame and private grief. She had survived by erasing a part of her life, and Sarah was about to ask her to perform a painful, violent excavation. This wasn't just about a footlocker. It was about demanding that her grandmother confront the one memory she had spent a lifetime trying to kill. The weight of this confrontation felt heavier than any corporate conspiracy, more dangerous than any veiled threat. Eleanor met her at the door, her face a mask of stoic neutrality, but her eyes, sharp and intelligent, betrayed a flicker of apprehension. She knew why Sarah was there. The news reports had breached her carefully constructed peace. When Sarah finally asked about the footlocker, the silence that followed was immense, a physical presence in the small, immaculate living room. "Some things are better left buried," Eleanor said, her voice brittle as autumn leaves. "You are stirring up a pain that has earned its rest." But Sarah saw something else in her grandmother's gaze. Not just pain, but a deep, unquenched flicker of doubt. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 5 decades, Eleanor nodded slowly and handed her a small, rusted key. "In the attic," she whispered. "It has been waiting for you long enough." The attic was a museum of a life interrupted. It smelled of cedar, dust, and time itself. In a dark corner, beneath a canvas sheet, sat the footlocker. It was a simple, sturdy thing, its metal clasps oxidized with age. As Sarah turned the key, the lock gave way with a sharp, protesting click that echoed in the heavy silence. The lid creaked open, releasing a faint metallic scent of oil and old paper. Inside, nestled among a trainman's worn leather gloves and a set of heavy steel wrenches, was a collection of pay stubs and maintenance logs. But beneath them all lay a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted it. This was his. A piece of him she could actually hold. It was the voice of a ghost, a silent witness that had been waiting half a century to tell its story. Sitting on the dusty attic floor, Sarah opened the journal, the fragile pages whispering as she turned them. The early entries were exactly what she expected: methodical notes on engine performance, weather conditions, and the mundane details of a life spent on the rails. His handwriting was neat, precise, the script of a man who valued order and control. But then, in the entries for early November 1973, the tone began to shift. The writing became more hurried, the lines slanted and urgent. He wrote of a last-minute manifest change, a special cargo that wasn't on the official paperwork. He described a meeting with a man from the main office, a man in a dark suit and a fedora who exuded an aura of cold, quiet authority he had never encountered before. A deep sense of unease bled through the ink, a man's growing fear being recorded in real time. The entry for November 11, 1973, the night before he vanished, was the key. Operation Sundown. Arthur had written, the words underlined twice. That's what the man in the fedora called it, an off-the-books route change through the old logging spurs. He said it was a matter of national importance. Gave me a new map. Said to burn it after. Something feels wrong. This isn't company business. This feels heavy. The words leaped off the page, a direct message from the past. Her grandfather wasn't a thief. He was a pawn in a clandestine operation, a good man who knew he was being forced to do something dangerous and wrong. The journal wasn't just a collection of notes. It was his testimony, a final, desperate attempt to leave a record of the truth, sealed away in the hope that someone, someday, would find it and understand. Sarah immediately took the journal to Frank Miller. The old trooper read the final entries in silence, his face grim, the lines around his eyes deepening with each page. When he looked up, the regret in his eyes was palpable. "National importance," he repeated, his voice a low growl. "That's how they get good men to do things they shouldn't. They wrap it in a flag." They spent the next 24 hours trying to find any official record of an Operation Sundown. They scoured declassified CIA archives, Pentagon logs, and federal agency databases from the era. They found nothing. The complete absence of any official trace was in itself damning proof. This was an operation so secret, so far off the books, that it had been designed from the start to be denied, to exist only in the memory of the men who executed it, men who had every reason to keep it buried. With the codename as a guidepost, Sarah's investigation turned back to the one entity at the center of it all, Blackwood Consolidated Minerals. She spent days digging into the company's financial history, cross-referencing public records with old news archives. What she found was staggering. In the fiscal year of 1974, just months after her grandfather's train disappeared, Blackwood Consolidated was awarded a series of massive, no-bid federal contracts for land reclamation projects, contracts that were completely outside their core business of coal mining. The value was astronomical, equivalent to over $150 million in today's money. It was a clear and undeniable payoff, a reward from powerful figures in Washington for the company's role in making a train, a man, and a secret cargo of immense value disappear into the Appalachian wilderness forever. Armed with her grandfather's journal and the evidence of a government payoff, Sarah secured a meeting with William Blackwood, Jr. His Charleston office was a temple of modern corporate power, all glass and steel, designed to project transparency while hiding everything. He listened to her accusations with a practiced, patient smile, his demeanor calm and condescending. "Ms. Coleman," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "you have a compelling work of fiction based on the ramblings of a troubled man. My father's company cooperated fully with the authorities in 1973. To suggest otherwise is not only libelous, it's deeply disrespectful to the difficult past your family has already endured. I would advise you to let this go. Some stories are best left untold for everyone's sake." The threat was not in his words, but in his eyes, a cold, hard promise of consequences. The official walls began to close in. The day after her meeting with Blackwood, the West Virginia State Police held a press conference. The spokesperson, reading from a prepared statement, announced that the crates contained unidentified, historically sensitive industrial materials, and that, due to the complexity of the case, the investigation was being transferred to a federal agency. They refused to name the agency or take any questions. It was a classic, bureaucratic maneuver, a way of burying the story under a mountain of classified red tape. Sarah's source within the state police stopped responding to her messages. The official channels were being systematically sealed, a clear sign that Blackwood's influence reached far beyond the hills of West Virginia and deep into the corridors of power in Washington. Just as the investigation seemed to be suffocating under official silence, a new message appeared in Sarah's encrypted inbox. It was from an anonymous source, someone she didn't recognize but who clearly knew what she was looking for. The message contained no text, only a single high-resolution image. It was a photograph of a document, a preliminary assessment report on official letterhead from Dr. Evelyn Reed's forensic team. Sarah's eyes scanned the technical jargon until they landed on a single phrase that made her heart stop, consistent with markings of the Leitner collection. She knew the name instantly. It was one of the most famous collections of priceless art and historical documents looted by the Nazis, believed to have been destroyed in the final days of World War II. Her grandfather hadn't just been hauling crates, he had been hauling a ghost of history, a treasure so vast it could rewrite the story of the war's end. That night, the abstract danger of her investigation became terrifyingly real. Sarah returned to her motel room late, her mind reeling from the revelation of the Leitner collection. As she inserted the keycard, she noticed the door was not fully latched. It was open by a fraction of an inch. A cold dread washed over her. She pushed it open slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs. The room was just as she had left it, her laptop on the desk, her clothes in her bag. Nothing appeared to be stolen. But then she saw it. Her grandfather's journal, which she had carefully hidden beneath a stack of case files, was now lying in the exact center of the perfectly made bed. It was open not to his final damning entry, but to a pristine blank page. The message was unmistakable. It was a silent, chilling warning. Stop writing this story. The chilling silence of the violated motel room was a declaration of war. The fear was a cold, sharp thing in Sarah's chest, but it was quickly consumed by a surge of defiant rage. They had breached her space, touched her grandfather's words, and left a message of absolute power, the power to erase. The blank page wasn't just a threat to stop, it was a promise that they could make her and her story disappear just as completely as they had Arthur Coleman. In that moment, her mission was forged into something harder, something unbreakable. It was no longer enough to find the truth. Now, she had to make sure it was a story they could never unwrite, a story that would outlive them all. She wasn't just fighting for his legacy anymore. She was fighting for her own survival. She immediately sent a coded message to Frank Miller, avoiding the compromised cellular network. They were here. The Journal. The response was instant and grim. "You're a target now, Sarah, not a reporter. They aren't trying to scare a journalist. They're trying to eliminate a witness." His words confirmed the cold reality that had been settling in her bones. He instructed her to leave immediately, to wipe her digital footprint, and to drive to a secluded cabin he owned deep in the Monongahela National Forest, a place without a mailing address or a cell tower. The investigation had crossed a critical threshold. It was no longer a matter of uncovering a historical conspiracy from a safe distance. It had become a real-time battle against a living, breathing enemy that was actively hunting her in the present day. Every minute spent in the motel room felt like a gamble. Sarah methodically wiped her laptop, packed her bag, and scanned her car for tracking devices with a small detector she carried for high-risk assignments. The paranoia felt earned. As she pulled out onto the dark, winding mountain highway, every pair of headlights in her rearview mirror felt like a predator. The familiar, beautiful Appalachian landscape transformed into a labyrinth of shadows, each darkened hollow a potential ambush site. The 50-year-old conspiracy was no longer a ghost story confined to the past. It was a palpable presence, its tendrils reaching into the present, turning the open road into a claustrophobic trap, and making her feel like a fugitive in her own homeland, pursued by forces she could not see but whose power she now understood intimately. The cabin was a fortress of analog solitude, smelling of pine and wood smoke. Inside, Frank had already spread out a collection of topographical maps from the 1970s across a large wooden table. He had been using Arthur's journal as a guide, his weathered finger tracing the off-the-books route. He pointed to a web of faint dotted lines branching off the main railway. "Abandoned logging spurs," he explained, his voice a low rumble. "They were Blackwood's private roads, completely unmonitored. This is where they would have diverted him. This whole mountain was their kingdom, Sarah. They didn't need the public tracks to move something they wanted to keep hidden. They had their own shadow network carved right into the wilderness, a perfect stage for an operation like Sundown." While Frank focused on the physical root of the conspiracy, Sarah delved deeper into its motive. The name Leitner Collection had opened a new, terrifying door. Her research revealed that while the collection was famous for its priceless art, its true value lay in something else: a vast archive of scientific research, patent diagrams, and advanced metallurgical schematics developed by the Third Reich's top engineers. This wasn't about aesthetics or cultural heritage. It was about weaponizable knowledge. The motive wasn't just greed. It was the pursuit of a technological supremacy that could reshape industries and tilt the balance of global power. Her grandfather hadn't been hauling mere paintings. He had been transporting the intellectual spoils of war, a prize of immense strategic importance. This new understanding led her to a name buried deep in declassified government archives: Dr. Klaus Richter, a brilliant German physicist who was quietly brought to America after the war under the clandestine Operation Paperclip program. While his official work was for the military, Sarah discovered a crucial link: a 1972 patent for a revolutionary deep earth drilling technology, a game-changer for the mining industry. The patent was filed by a shell corporation owned by Blackwood Consolidated Minerals, and its co-inventor was listed as none other than Dr. Richter. The science described in the patent was years ahead of its time, mirroring theories found only in the missing Leitner documents. The connection was undeniable. Blackwood's modern empire was built on a foundation of stolen Nazi science. The full, monstrous scope of the conspiracy finally came into focus. William Blackwood Sr. hadn't just been a facilitator, he had been a primary beneficiary. He had struck a devil's bargain with a faction of the U.S. government, who wanted to leverage Nazi intellect against the Soviets in the Cold War. They provided the scientist and the political cover. Blackwood provided the private infrastructure to move the assets and the corporate entity to exploit them. Operation Sundown was the final critical step in this unholy alliance, the physical transfer of the source material. Arthur Coleman was not just a random victim. He was the last loose end in a decades-long conspiracy of treason, corporate espionage, and murder. A simple, good man sacrificed to protect a secret that implicated the very heart of the American industrial military complex. As Sarah explained the connections, a 50-year-old memory sparked in Frank Miller's mind. The man in the fedora he had seen with Blackwood Sr. on the day of the disappearance. He suddenly remembered the man's cold, detached professionalism, his aura of absolute authority. He wasn't a corporate lawyer or a company executive. He had the unmistakable bearing of a federal operative, one of the shadowy figures from the Nixon era who specialized in extra-legal operations. "It was one of them," Frank whispered, the color draining from his face. This wasn't just a Blackwood operation sanctioned by the government. The government was running the show. They used Blackwood's company, his railroad, and his control over this town as a deniable cutout for a black op. The enemy was no longer just a corporation or a corrupt family. It was a hydra, a shadow network woven into the very fabric of power, connecting corporate boardrooms in West Virginia to clandestine agencies in Washington. William Blackwood Jr. wasn't just protecting a dirty family secret about stolen art. He was the modern custodian of a foundational lie of the Cold War, a secret that, if exposed, could destabilize legacies and institutions far beyond his own. The forces aligned against Sarah were not just powerful. They were systemic. They had the ability to classify evidence, silence witnesses, and rewrite history because, in a very real sense, they were the authors of the official record. Her investigation was no longer just a threat to a company. It was a threat to the state itself. Sarah knew then that the story could never be broken through conventional means. No newspaper would touch it. No television network would air it. It would be dismissed as a baseless conspiracy theory, and she would be discredited, silenced, or worse. She needed something more than her grandfather's journal or a leaked report. She needed irrefutable, physical proof that could not be buried under a mountain of federal classifications, something tangible from the scene of the crime, something the cleanup crew might have missed in their haste 50 years ago. The entire focus of her investigation shifted from uncovering history and archives to finding its last remaining artifact in the wild, a final, desperate gambit for a truth that could not be denied. Her gaze fell upon the old map, her finger tracing the faint, dotted line of the abandoned logging spur to a specific, remote intersection deep in the mountains. It was the most logical point of interception, a place where a small, determined team could have stopped the train, forced her grandfather to comply, and then executed their plan. The truth wasn't in a file in Washington, or a vault in Charleston. It was out there, preserved in the soil and silence of the Appalachian wilderness, waiting at the precise location where Arthur Coleman's life was stolen from him. "We have to go there, Frank," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "It's the only place they couldn't sanitize. It's the only place left where he might have left something behind for us to find." The old pickup truck groaned in protest as Frank Miller navigated the barely there logging spur, its tires slipping on a bed of damp, decaying leaves that had lain undisturbed for decades. Every snap of a twig under the wheels sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the forest. Sarah sat rigid in the passenger seat, her grandfather's journal clutched in her lap, its worn leather a fragile shield against the mounting dread. The air grew colder, thicker, heavy, with the scent of pine and wet earth, a primordial smell that felt like a warning. They were driving into a place that had been deliberately forgotten, a wound on the landscape that had been left to scar over. Each mile deeper into the wilderness felt like a step further back in time, toward a moment of violence that had been patiently waiting in the shadows for 50 years. They finally reached the end of the line, where the earth fell away into a deep, jagged ravine. Below, a creek carved a path through a bed of dark, slick rocks. Spanning the chasm were the skeletal remains of a collapsed railway trestle, its massive wooden beams blackened with age and rot, surrendering slowly to the relentless pull of gravity. This was the place. It was a natural dead end, a perfect choke point. The silence here was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was absolute, the kind of profound quiet that follows a catastrophic event. Nature had done its best to reclaim the scene, with moss covering the old rail ties and saplings sprouting from the disturbed earth, but it could not erase the feeling of violation that clung to the air like a persistent fog. This was a place where a life had been violently interrupted. Frank stood at the edge, his eyes scanning the terrain with a practiced, analytical gaze. "They would have blocked the track right before the trestle," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that was quickly swallowed by the vastness of the space. A felled tree, a vehicle, anything. He would have had no choice but to stop. No room to turn, no way to back up a train that long. He was trapped. Frank's words painted a ghostly tableau against the backdrop of the decaying bridge, reanimating the scene from 50 years prior. Sarah could almost see it, the sudden jarring halt of the train, the hiss of the air brakes, the heavy silence that followed, and then the appearance of figures emerging from the dense woods, their faces obscured by the deepening twilight of a November afternoon. A cold, biting wind swept up from the ravine, cutting through Sarah's jacket. She felt an overwhelming urge to call out her grandfather's name, to send his name echoing into the space where his life had been stolen. This was more than a crime scene. It was a gravesite, an unmarked tomb for a man whose memory had been desecrated. She tried to imagine his final moments, the confusion turning to fear, the dawning, horrific realization that this was not a simple robbery. Did he fight? Did he plead? Or did he face them with the quiet dignity the journal suggested he possessed? The weight of these unanswered questions was a physical pressure in her chest, a grief so profound it was almost suffocating, a sorrow for a man she never knew, but whose courage she was only just beginning to understand. They began their search with a grim, methodical purpose. Frank moved with the slow, deliberate pace of an old cop working a cold case, his eyes scanning the ground for anything unnatural, a rusted shell casing, a button from a coat, a piece of metal that didn't belong. Sarah focused on the area around the creek bed, scrambling down the steep, shale-covered embankment. She reasoned that if her grandfather had tried to hide something, he would have used the chaos of the terrain to his advantage, tossing it where it would be least likely to be found by men searching in the dark. Every rust-colored rock looked like a piece of evidence. Every gnarled root seemed to hide a secret. The task felt hopeless, a search for a single grain of truth in a wilderness of lies and lost time. Her foot slipped on a patch of wet moss covering a large, flat stone, and she threw out a hand to steady herself. Her fingers plunged into the cold, soft earth at the base of the rock, and she felt something hard, unyielding, and distinctly man-made. It was a sharp, metallic edge. Her breath caught in her throat. She dug frantically with her bare hands, ignoring the sting of the cold mud and the sharp edges of hidden pebbles. Slowly, a corner of dark, oxidized metal emerged from the soil. It wasn't a rock or a piece of the old trestle. It was a box. A cold thrill, equal parts terror and triumph, shot through her. She called out to Frank, her voice tight and strained, a sound that was both a cry of discovery and a plea for confirmation that she wasn't imagining it. Together they carefully worked the object free from the earth's grip. It was a dented, rectangular metal box, its surface pitted with 50 years of rust, but miraculously intact, sealed against the elements. As Frank wiped away the caked-on mud and grime with his handkerchief, faint, stenciled letters began to appear on the lid. The first initial was an A, then a surname that made Sarah's heart stop beating. Coleman. It was his lunchbox. A mundane object, a simple container for a midday meal, transformed by time and tragedy into a sacred relic. This was a direct, tangible connection to her grandfather's last day, a piece of his ordinary life left behind at the scene of its extraordinary end. The air grew thick with the presence of his ghost, a silent witness to their discovery. The clasp was fused shut with rust. Frank retrieved a heavy multi-tool from his belt and worked the blade into the seam, prying with a steady pressure. The metal groaned in protest, a long, screeching sound that echoed off the ravine walls, a sound of something sealed for half a century finally being forced to give up its secret. The lid popped open with a final, percussive snap. The air inside was stale, musty, the preserved breath of 1973. Nestled within was a dented thermos, the brittle, yellowed wax paper of an uneaten sandwich, and, tucked securely into a leather strap in the lid, a small, dark pouch made of oilskin, the kind used to keep tobacco or documents dry from the rain. It was a time capsule of a man's final, interrupted routine. With hands that trembled uncontrollably, Sarah lifted the oilskin pouch. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. She fumbled with the drawstring, her fingers numb with cold and anticipation. She tipped the contents into her palm. It wasn't a note. It wasn't a confession. It was a single, heavy brass key, its surface greened with age. Attached to its ring was a small, circular metal tag. She angled it to catch the weak afternoon light, her eyes struggling to make out the tiny, stamped letters and numbers. There was a long serial code, and then, beneath it, a single word that burned itself into her mind, a word that connected every single thread of the conspiracy. The word was Leitner. It was a key to one of the crates. A wave of understanding so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. This wasn't something he dropped by accident. This was a deliberate act. In his final, terrifying moments, knowing he was going to die, Arthur Coleman had performed one last act of defiance. He had secured a piece of irrefutable proof, the key that physically linked the secret cargo to its name, and had hidden it, a final, desperate message to the future. He wasn't just a victim who was erased. He was a hero who had fought back in the only way he could, planting a seed of truth in the earth, praying that one day someone would come looking for it. The shame her family had carried for 50 years dissolved in an instant, replaced by a fierce, heartbreaking, and overwhelming sense of pride. Just as this profound emotional revelation crested, a new sound intruded, slicing through the sacred silence of the ravine. It started as a faint, distant pulse and grew rapidly into a deep, rhythmic whump-whump-whump that vibrated through the ground. It was the sound of a helicopter, and it was getting closer, fast. Sarah and Frank exchanged a look of pure, animal terror. It appeared over the ridge, not a news or police aircraft, but a sleek, black, unmarked machine, a predator descending from the sky. They hadn't just found the truth's guardians had found them. The abstract threat of a shadowy conspiracy had just materialized into a very real, very immediate physical danger. "Run!" Frank's voice was a raw, guttural command. He grabbed the lunchbox, shoving it into Sarah's arms, and pulled her toward the steep embankment. Adrenaline surged through her, cold and sharp, eclipsing the grief and the triumph. They scrambled up the loose shale, the roar of the helicopter becoming a deafening, physical force, its rotor wash tearing at the trees, sending a shower of leaves and debris down upon them. The sound was everywhere, inescapable, the angry buzz of a hornet's nest they had just kicked. They were exposed, miles from civilization, and the people who had murdered her grandfather now had them in their sights. The 50-year-old crime was not over. It was reaching its bloody, violent conclusion. They burst from the tree line and sprinted for the truck. Frank fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as Sarah threw herself into the passenger seat, clutching the metal box to her chest as if it were a shield. The engine roared to life, and the truck fishtailed in the mud, tires screaming as it lurched onto the narrow logging road. The black helicopter banked sharply, effortlessly keeping pace, a mechanical angel of death hovering just above the canopy. Sarah looked down at the rusted lunchbox in her lap, the key a heavy weight inside. They were being hunted, and they might not survive the next 10 minutes, but in that terrifying moment, one thing was clear. She had the truth. She had her grandfather's last weapon, and she would die before she let them bury it with her. The old truck screamed down the overgrown logging road, a desperate, metallic cry against the relentless percussive roar of the helicopter. Trees blurred into a solid wall of green on either side, their branches whipping at the windows like skeletal fingers. Frank Miller drove with a grim, focused intensity, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes darting between the muddy track ahead and the rearview mirror, which was filled with the menacing black shape of their pursuer. Sarah clutched the rusted lunchbox to her chest, the weight of the brass key inside a cold, dense point of reality in a world that had dissolved into pure, chaotic motion. They were not just being followed, they were being herded, corralled like animals by a predator that owned the sky, its shadow sweeping over them, a constant, suffocating promise of the inevitable end of the road. "They won't let us reach the highway," Frank yelled over the engine's protest in the deafening rotor wash. "They'll force us off the road, into a ravine. We can't outrun them, but we might be able to lose them." His eyes, honed by a lifetime of navigating this unforgiving terrain, scanned the dense woods ahead. "There's an old mine entrance about a mile from here, the Blackwood No. 4. It's been sealed for 60 years, but a rock slide opened up a side fissure a few winters back. It's our only chance." It was a desperate gambit, a flight from a modern hunter into a tomb from the past. The plan was terrifying in its simplicity. They would trade the open, visible terror of the chase for the claustrophobic, unknown darkness of the earth itself, hoping the mountain that had hidden one secret for 50 years might be willing to hide another. They saw the fissure a moment before they would have missed it, a dark, jagged wound in the side of the mountain, partially obscured by a thicket of rhododendron. Frank wrenched the wheel, sending the truck sliding sideways in the mud, its momentum carrying it to a halt just feet from the opening. "Go! Now!" he commanded. They abandoned the vehicle, scrambling out into the maelstrom of noise and wind from the descending helicopter. The air was thick, with the smell of churned earth and diesel fumes. They plunged into the narrow opening, the sudden, absolute darkness, a shocking contrast to the daylight. Behind them, the roar of the helicopter reached a crescendo as it hovered directly over the abandoned truck, its searchlight cutting a sterile, white cone into the forest, a futile attempt to find two people who had just been swallowed whole by the mountain. Inside the mine, the air was cold and dead, heavy with the scent of damp stone and a silence so profound it pressed in on them. Frank produced a powerful flashlight from his jacket, its beam cutting a shaky path through the oppressive blackness. While he stood guard, watching the entrance, Sarah dropped to her knees and pulled a small pelican-cased satellite modem from her bag. It was her lifeline, a tool for sending stories from the most remote corners of the world. With trembling fingers, she connected it to her laptop, its small indicator lights blinking to life, a tiny constellation of hope in the subterranean night. She began to upload everything, high-resolution scans of every page of Arthur's journal, a crystal-clear photo of the Leitner key, and a raw, unedited narrative detailing the entire 50-year conspiracy. It was a race against the modem's slow connection, and the certainty that their pursuers would not give up. She compiled the data into a single, encrypted package, a digital bomb built from a half-century of lies. The address list was a journalist's nuclear option, the national desks of the New York Times and the Washington Post, the international wires of Reuters and the Associated Press, and a network of investigative reporting consortiums across Europe. As a final failsafe, she sent it to a secure, anonymous server she maintained, a digital dead man's switch. She hovered her finger over the Enter key, took a deep, shuddering breath, and clicked. The progress bar crawled across the screen with agonizing slowness. Just as the words "Upload complete" appeared, the beam of Frank's flashlight caught movement at the fissure's entrance. The story was out. It now existed in 100 places at once. It could no longer be buried with them. The figures that emerged from the fissure moved with a quiet, predatory efficiency, their forms silhouetted against the daylight. They were not uniformed police or military. They were dressed in tactical gear, their faces impassive, their movements economical and precise. They were private contractors, the kind of men who operated in the legal and moral gray areas on behalf of powerful clients. Their leader stepped forward, his eyes falling on the rusted lunchbox in Sarah's hands. "Mr. Blackwood would be very grateful to have that back," he said, his voice calm and devoid of any emotion. "It's a family heirloom, you see. Sentimental value." The lie was so audacious, so utterly detached from the violence of the moment, that it was more terrifying than any overt threat. They were here to sanitize the past, and Sarah and Frank were the final stains to be scrubbed clean. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the air, a distant but rapidly approaching chorus of sirens. Frank allowed himself a grim, tight-lipped smile. Before they had entered the mine, he had used a burner phone to make one last call to the state police dispatch, reporting a private helicopter terrorizing the area and the sound of automatic gunfire near the abandoned Blackwood No. 4. The cavalry was coming. The contractors exchanged a look, their professional calm finally cracking. Their window of opportunity had slammed shut. The arrival of official, uniformed law enforcement transformed the situation from a clandestine execution into a complicated, high-profile standoff. William Blackwood, Jr.'s deniable assets were about to become very, very public. The shadow war for the truth was about to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. The following morning, the story exploded across the globe. It was more than a headline. It was a cultural detonation. Sarah's data package, authenticated by frantic overnight work from a dozen newsrooms, laid the conspiracy bare in irrefutable detail. The tale of the Blackwood train was on every screen, a gripping narrative of Nazi treasure, Cold War black operations, corporate greed, and a 50-year cover-up. Arthur Coleman's anxious journal entries were read aloud by news anchors, his dignified photograph juxtaposed with the menacing image of the unmarked black helicopter. The public, already primed for stories of deep-state corruption, was captivated. The carefully constructed myth of the runaway engineer was shattered, replaced by the far more compelling reality of a murdered hero. The outcry was a tidal wave of righteous fury. For William Blackwood, Jr., the world he had so carefully curated simply ceased to exist. His company's stock vaporized in the opening minutes of trading. Federal agents, armed with warrants citing Sarah's evidence, raided his corporate headquarters in Charleston and his sprawling private estate. He was arrested on live television, not for a murder his father had committed 50 years ago, but for a cascade of modern crimes that were now undeniable. Conspiracy to commit kidnapping, illegal surveillance, and the deployment of an unregistered private security force against American citizens. The polished, philanthropic veneer was stripped away, revealing the same ruthless ambition that had driven his father. His legacy, and the entire Blackwood dynasty, was reduced to a cautionary tale of hubris and historical sin. Forced into the public spotlight, the federal government could no longer hide behind a wall of classification. A visibly shaken spokesperson for the National Archives confirmed the cargo's identity. Dr. Evelyn Reed's full report was released, detailing how the crates contained not only priceless works of art from the Leitner collection, but also a trove of advanced scientific research documents. The report confirmed Sarah's theory. This stolen knowledge, particularly in metallurgy and physics, had been secretly funneled into Blackwood's company, forming the technological bedrock of its modern empire. The art and artifacts were carefully catalogued for repatriation, beginning the long, slow process of returning them to the families from whom they had been stolen by the Nazis nearly a century before. The train's secret was finally a matter of public record. In Beckley, West Virginia, the resolution was more personal. A quiet but seismic shift in the town's collective memory. The story of Arthur Coleman was retold, not as folklore but as fact. The local newspaper, whose predecessors had helped slander his name in 1973, ran a full-page front-page retraction and apology. At a solemn public ceremony, attended by hundreds, the mayor officially exonerated Arthur Coleman of all wrongdoing, declaring him a hero who had been a silent victim of forces far beyond his control. A simple, elegant granite monument was unveiled in a small park across from the rail yard, its inscription reading, Arthur Coleman, an honest man on his final run, his truth now home. The ghost of the runaway engineer was finally laid to rest, his honor restored. Sarah sat in her grandmother's quiet living room, the television murmuring in the background. She watched the reports with her mother and Eleanor. There was no sense of victory, no triumphant celebration, only the heavy, profound stillness that follows a long and brutal war. Eleanor, the stoic matriarch who had encased her heart in 50 years of protective silence, finally broke. Tears streamed down her wrinkled face, silent at first, then giving way to deep, shuddering sobs. She was not crying for the shame she had endured, but for the good man she had loved, the husband whose memory she had been forced to lock away. In that moment, the unspoken generational trauma that had defined the Coleman women finally fractured, allowing the first rays of a difficult, complicated healing to shine through. Weeks later, Sarah stood alone before her grandfather's monument, the cool autumn air rustling the leaves of the nearby oak trees. She placed a hand on the cold granite, tracing the letters of his name. The men who had ordered his death were ghosts themselves, long dead and beyond the reach of any earthly court. Justice, in its purest form, was impossible. But the truth had been found. His name was clear. His final, desperate act of hiding that key had not been in vain. It had been a seed of defiance that had taken 50 years to bloom. She had not only solved a crime, but had reclaimed a family's honor, rewriting not just a historical record, but her own identity. The shame was gone, replaced by the quiet, enduring legacy of a good man who did the right thing in his final moments. The mountains of West Virginia have a long memory, but they do not pass judgment. They simply hold the truth, waiting. For Sarah Coleman, the story of BCM 734 was never truly about bringing villains to justice. The architects of Operation Sundown were long dead, their sins turned to dust. It was about excavation. It was about digging a single honest name out from under a 50-year mountain of carefully constructed lies. Standing before the granite monument, she understood that the truth wasn't a weapon for vengeance, but a tool for restoration. It couldn't change the violent end of her grandfather's life, but it had forever changed the meaning of it, transforming a legacy of shame into one of quiet, profound, and enduring heroism that would now stand as solid and steadfast as the hills themselves. The ripples of her discovery spread far beyond the quiet hollows of Appalachia. The repatriation of the Leitner collection became a global event, a painful but necessary reckoning with a dark chapter of history. Each painting returned to a family, each document restored to an archive, was a small victory against the forces that had tried to erase not just a man, but an entire culture. Dr. Evelyn Reed's work continued, her forensic analysis of the Blackwood train's cargo leading to the identification of other lost assets and exposing the tendrils of a network that had profited from the spoils of war for decades. A single, rusted freight car, half buried in the American wilderness, had forced the world to confront the ghosts it had long pretended were gone, proving that history's debts always, eventually, come due. Miles away, in a small house just outside Beckley, Frank Miller finally found a measure of peace. For 50 years, the ghost of Arthur Coleman's unsolved case had been a constant, silent companion, a daily reminder of a failure of nerve and a system that had been too powerful to fight. Now, the silence in his home felt different. It was no longer heavy with regret, but light with the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. On the shelf, where an empty space had long represented his greatest professional failure, there now sat a small, framed photograph of Arthur Coleman, smiling, a gift from Sarah. It was a simple acknowledgement of a debt paid, a circle closed. The old trooper had gotten his second chance, and this time he had seen it through to the end. The corporate empire, built on a foundation of stolen science and historical crime, crumbled with breathtaking speed. Blackwood Consolidated Minerals, once an untouchable titan of industry, was dismantled, its assets seized and liquidated by federal authorities to pay for decades of fraud and corruption. The name Blackwood, once synonymous with power and influence in West Virginia, became a permanent stain, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and union halls. In a final, fitting act of poetic justice, the wind farm project that had inadvertently started it all was taken over by a new consortium. The turbines would still rise on those ridges, but now they would stand not as monuments to a tainted legacy, but as symbols of a future striving to be cleaner and more honest than the past. Sarah's life was irrevocably altered. She had set out to investigate a story and had ended up rewriting her own. The fierce, objective journalist had been forced to confront the deeply personal trauma that had unknowingly shaped her entire life. She turned down a lucrative offer from a national news network, choosing instead to stay in the small apartment in Charleston, closer to the mountains that now felt like a part of her. She began to write, not just a series of articles, but a book. Its title was simple: The Engineer. It was her final act of reclamation, an effort to give her grandfather back not just his honor, but his humanity, ensuring the world remembered not just how Arthur Coleman died, but how he had lived. She kept the rusted lunchbox. It sat on her writing desk, next to her laptop, a constant, tangible link to the past. It was a mundane object transfigured into a sacred relic, a symbol of everything the conspiracy had tried and failed to erase. Inside, the brass Leitner key lay on a bed of velvet she had placed there. It was a reminder that the most powerful weapons against vast, faceless systems are often small, personal, and human. The lunchbox was a testament to a man's final, defiant thought, a quiet act of resistance that had echoed through time. It was proof that no conspiracy, no matter how meticulously planned or brutally enforced, can ever fully account for the simple, unpredictable courage of an ordinary person pushed to their absolute limit. The story of the Blackwood train became a new kind of Appalachian folklore. The cautionary tale of the runaway engineer was replaced by the inspiring legend of the man who hid the key, a story of integrity in the face of insurmountable power. The mountains, once seen as a place where secrets were swallowed whole, were now viewed differently, as patient guardians, as a silent, waiting witness. The drone, an emissary of the future, had been sent to map the Earth for a new age of energy, but it had instead uncovered a dark truth from an old one. It was a profound reminder that the past is never truly past. It is written into the land itself, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for the right tool or the right person to bring it back into the light. The world now knew what was on that train, but the full scope of the network that put it there remained shrouded in the classified archives of the Cold War. The story of the Blackwood train was over, but the questions it raised were just beginning. If a secret this vast could be kept hidden for 50 years, how many other ghost trains are out there, waiting in the dark with their own impossible cargo? We told you this story to honor a good man's name, but we also want you to think about the secrets buried in your own backyards. What would you do if you found a key to a history that powerful people wanted to keep locked away? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because this was just the start of something much bigger. Ultimately, the tale of Arthur Coleman is not a story about the triumph of justice, but about the stubborn, indestructible nature of truth. It is a testament to the idea that a single, honest voice, even one silenced for half a century, can eventually become a roar that brings down empires. The lies of powerful men, written in official reports and whispered into folklore, proved to be ephemeral, brittle things when faced with the simple, undeniable facts of a man's life, recorded in his own hand and hidden with his final act of hope. His story serves as an enduring promise that no secret is safe forever, no lie can outrun the passage of time, and the truth, no matter how deep it is buried, will always find its way home.